Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
The comfort is just being together. The comfort is having each other.
They need to come and look at it as
Yes.
look at the tragedy.
Yes.
Don't come and look at taking out selfies.
No.
You're standing
No,
up.
no.
Let's
See?
take a picture.
No.
Come on.
We want
This
people.
is
We want
not
people to know what's
respectful.
happened.
You know, you need to feel what we felt.
They've let us down. This borough. It's let us down. Honest to God. Look, this
There's
is
so
my
many
borough.
questions and no answers. Heart-wrenching. It's heartbreaking because you don't know. Nobody's not giving you no answers.
We were lost for words. We didn't know what to do, how to react, you know, like, I've never known anything like it in my life, so.
I wrote up these signs, I went and photocopied them, I made this sign, and I came back out, and I've been here for, I don't know, a few hours, just making my way. Basically, I'm trying to do a square of this area, and put these posters everywhere.
That's the picture right there. If you see the picture, she's missing. We're looking for her, and she's friend to my little children as well. So they're at home always crying, thinking, Daddy, we're not going to see her again. In a situation like this, you still hope to find her. That's just what everybody's looking for.
Quite a lot of children in the area, and sadly, quite a few lives that we'll never see again.
You know, of course, people are continually say they want justice. They want someone to pay, and you know, most of these people are angry, and their anger is understandable.
We've walked here in dignity. We've walked here in silence. We've made it clear to the government that we are not violent. We're not aggressive. We just want answers.
You begin to feel survivor's guilt, and I think maybe not now, but within the next couple of months, we will start to question, why was it them, why wasn't it us, why did we survive, why didn't they? And that will always be something that will be eating away at our minds.
I just want a place where I can just start over, have a room to myself, and just relax for a bit. I just want a home again.
Live today from the Maxilla Social Centre, which sits in the shadow of Grenfell Tower, a block that remains charred and looming over this corner of London. We have various scheduled appointments today. We'll be with you until 1 o'clock. But also, as ever on this programme, there's a degree of freedom, fluidity, that means I don't know exactly where the conversation is going to go until you help me direct it. I'll tell you something, though, straight away. I thought on the way here, especially after political events last night, that we may have some sort of conflict or confusion of interests, and that we would have to slightly rejig our plans to accommodate the Brexit shenanigans that, of course, have dominated the breaking news. The minute I got here, though, those doubts disappeared. It puts stuff into perspective, an event like Grenfell. And 6 months later, it's possibly, and maybe a little premature on this, it's possibly time to look forward as much as to look back. There's a very different air, a very different atmosphere around the community centre and around the block itself. Some of the memorials remain on the railings outside. Some of them have achieved a sort of protected status to ensure that the people who live here and the people who continue to reel from the events of that night have their wishes respected. And I don't know, we'll find out. If you are connected to the community and you're listening to the programme, this is in a sense a sort of companion piece to the memorial service that's unfolding at St Paul's, because of course not everybody could go there, but it's also I hope an opportunity to reflect upon the work that has gone into rebuilding the community, to helping a lot of the people whose lives were profoundly affected, and looking at the areas in which that ongoing work not only continues but also perhaps begins to register some successes. Last time I was here, 5 months ago, there was something I meant to mention to you but didn't. Echoes, if you will, of a tragedy that occurred in 1937 when the Hindenburg airship exploded live on camera. And there's a very famous quote from the announcer that day, a journalist called Herbert Morrison as he watched the tragedy unfold that eventually left 36 people dead, almost exactly half of the number that died at Grenfell. And you're probably familiar with the phrase. He said, "Oh, the humanity. Oh, the humanity." And that seems, in some corners of the media, to have disappeared in the months since. The simple recognition that humanity is universal. Humanity is a condition under which we all live, whether we have long and unpronounceable names or whether we have apostrophes in our names, or whether we have simple British bulldog names, whether we wear headscarves or berets or top hats or bowler hats, whatever it may be. The humanity is what appears to have united most people in their response to Grenfell, and perhaps oddly alienated some others. You'll understand that we'll be mostly ignoring those others today. We'll be focusing on people who recognise the shared humanity of everybody, both affected and observing this tragedy, and hoping, I suppose, in our own clumsy way, to contribute something of value to the unfolding scenario. It means that there are two tracks for me, and again, if you're kind enough to listen to the programme on a regular basis, you'll know that I may well have to retreat from this observation before 10:15. But it seems to me that there is the political and the personal, and they are linked and overlapping, but first thought that struck me since I got here is that they're also quite distinct. There is the political battle for answers, the search for answers, the fear of some sort of hobby horsing, calls by right-wing media accusing some of the people representing the residents of politicising it. It is politics. The notion that people complained for years to politicians about the possibility of this tragedy occurring and then it happened, that is just politics. It's almost the definition of the word. It comes from the Greek for people. To try to depoliticise this issue would be to try to remove the people from it. But I'm with your help today, I'm going to try and walk both of those paths in a sort of parallel fashion, the political questions, but also the personal questions. And while the political questions remain largely unanswered and the inquiry continues to address them, some of those personal questions, I cautiously hope, will have slightly more optimistic and upbeat answers than perhaps I was expecting before I got here. Emma Dent-Coad is, of course, the Labour MP for this corner of London, and she's at St Paul's this morning, waiting for that memorial service to commence, but she's joining me on the line now. Did that make sense to you, Emma? This idea that, I've been down a few times since we were last here broadcasting. I've been down in a personal capacity, and it seems that the personal investment in the tragedy and the personal rebuilding of lives is somehow separate from the ongoing political and legalistic questions.
Yes, I can see what you mean there. It is everyone's Grenfell now, I know that, and a lot of people have taken on particular battles for particular people. And, you know, obviously politics is within it, but today's not the day for politics, is it? We're here for the bereaved and survivors, and this is the personal and coming together and the community feeling. I just walked through a crowd and everybody's hugging each other and hugging me, and it's a most amazing feeling, which goes wherever we go, and anybody connected with Grenfell feels like that.
Why do you think that is? I kind of wouldn't have been surprised if there was still very much a sombre and sad air over proceedings. Everybody had turned up today at St Paul's with a very heavy heart and a very heavy burden. And while that obviously is the case, I have been struck by that sense of return, by that sense of bouncing back.
Yes, I do think maybe we're at a turning point now. It feels like that in the community, but of course the main thing is to get people housed, which is the huge issue. But I do feel a bit of hope, to be honest. I do. Good. I think people are taking control in slightly more formal ways, where they were just helping out before, and that's a good thing as well. People are being empowered, and that's massive. It's a huge difference.
That's the word. It feels that way. We should talk briefly about the housing issue, because it has confused a lot of us, and there is a lot of obfuscation and confusion. Elizabeth Campbell, speaking to Nick Ferrari on LBC yesterday, made some comments that we shall examine more closely later in the programme. But somebody said something to me last night when we were talking about this, and wondering why people hadn't been rehoused more quickly, and even expressing some perhaps slightly unkind thoughts about the people waiting for their houses. The largest element of it seems to me to be the fact that nobody ever moves into a new home, which could in fact be their family home forever, without having a proper long hard think about whether it is the right home for them. The idea that you just take a key from a council without knowing what door it's going to open, and if you demand the right to have a look and a think and a proper contemplation of circumstances, you're somehow doing something wrong. I guess I'm suggesting it's a lot simpler than some of the coverage suggests. All you have to do is imagine what process you went through before you chose the home that you currently live in.
Yeah, I think, no, there is definitely that element, but there is also the element some people are being offered things that aren't suitable. They're not in the right place, they're not the right size, they haven't got 2 bedrooms, they've got 2.5, and they're thinking, well, we're going to be here forever now, and this is our forever home, and anybody who's going to move somewhere forever and recover from what they've been through, it has to feel right for them. And if they're looking over a railway line or up against a brick wall or whatever it may be, or they're too many floors up, that's not going to be right for them. So in some cases, I think the home just isn't right for them physically, and in some cases, it could be right that people are reflecting more. But there are a lot of people who are just not being offered what they need.
Well, we're going to look into that further. Is there any sense, and bearing in mind that we're sort of not removing the political elements, but perhaps just sort of treating them with a little more softness than usual, have the council improved their performance? I think most people would agree there was a dereliction of duty in the immediate aftermath. You could perhaps mitigate some of the criticism by pointing out that the events were so unprecedented that it would be almost impossible to have a full response plan in place. Have they, in your opinion, since there was a change of personnel at the top of the council, of which you used to be a member, have they improved? Have they sort of restored some of their credibility or not?
I don't see that. And actually, some of the survivors are saying that the council is hardening against them. In fact, yesterday we had the first reported eviction, so that somebody had a notice of eviction, somebody from the walkways who was told they were going to be moved out, who was a temporary tenant. So the people who come to me are the people who are probably in the worst state, but they're telling me that they're feeling, some are feeling bullied by housing officers trying to get them housed, and the idea of an eviction notice just before Christmas is pretty horrendous, and we're looking into that. So I don't, to be honest, I don't see that myself.
And yet, there's clearly no accusation or criticism still in place that would be an absence. It was the absolute absence of these people from both the scene and the story in the 7 or 8 days after the tragedy that I think struck many as almost incomprehensible. That's no longer the case.
Yeah, absolutely. Totally incomprehensible. There was literally nobody there. It was extraordinary, which is why people stepped up and took over, and they're still taking over, as I say, in some ways more formally now, which is a good thing. People need to be empowered when they've been working and doing the council's work for 6 months in some cases.
Emma Denko, the Labour MP for Kensington, joining us from St Paul's, where the memorial service today will mark the 6-month anniversary of the Grenfell Tower tragedy. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where, well, as ever on the programme, the course that we follow for the next 2 3/4 hours is up to you as much as it is up to me. If you have connections to the community, or if you have evidence or stories similar to the one Emma just told, I'd love to hear from you today. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. You can tweet me, of course, at Mr. James OB, or email james@lbc.co.uk. It's a question really of, do you know what, actually? Come here a minute. My challenge today is to make everybody listening to this programme reflect upon Grenfell with a recognition that it could have been any of us. That seems to have been what some corners of our media have managed to chase away from our consciousness. That simple, empathetic fact that the people that we charge with looking after us, or with at least providing the infrastructure and the most basic presumptions of security and safety, quit the field on this one. And if it can happen to the people that died in that tower that night, then theoretically it could happen to any one of us. And if we can just bring that back to front and centre, while simultaneously reflecting on some of the positivity and some of the improvement that is occurring, then, well, I hope we won't have wasted our time. It's 10:15. Live today from the Grenfell Tower community, from a social centre that sits just a couple of 100 yards away from it, a social centre that has done amazing work for this community, very much sort of the lifeblood of the people that live around here. And it also, of course, reminds us of some of the stories that we heard in the immediate aftermath of the tragedy. In fact, indeed, in 1 or 2 cases, while it was still unfolding. I will remind you of one of the firefighters that rang into the programme in just a second, and then we'll talk to Matt Rack, the General Secretary of the Fire Brigades Union. Before that, I would give you a quick heads up. I am keen to take calls from people in the area today, or people affected by it, because not everybody will be at St Paul's, and yet, of course, everybody who is within pretty much a 2 or 3 mile radius of where I'm sitting now will have been in one way or another affected. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. The morning we came to work, after the fire, or indeed while the fire was still unfolding and the full details were yet to emerge, there were people listening to the programme who had been on the scene as first responders. Adrian was one of them.
On arrival, what we saw was something from a movie scene, mate, to be quite honest. It was just simply breathtaking and unbelievable. So we walked in through the crowds to join our colleagues, and it was just complete pandemonium. We had casualties being ferried left, right and centre, and we immediately got to work in very, very difficult circumstances. It's something that I pray to God that we never have to witness anything like that again, to be honest, mate. Some very harrowing stories. A lot of the guys have experienced a lot of stuff that will live with them for a very, very long time.
Adrian talking to me there the morning of the Grenfell Tower tragedy. Matt Rack is the General Secretary of the Fire Brigades Union. Adrian, obviously, one of your members, Matt. Is it possible to get a handle on the psychological help that your members have needed in the past 6 months?
Morning, James. I think it's still early days, really. Yes. These things sometimes take years to come through, so I think some people are very affected very quickly. Some people put on a brave face, and as I say, with some people it will take a long time to feed through. I don't think anyone can ever forget something like that, and it will live with people forever.
When did you join the brigade?
Me, 1983.
1983. Just give me a quick handle, if you would, on how much the recognition of mental health issues has changed in that period between then and now.
Oh, hugely. Yes. I think at the time when I started out in the fire service, it was people were expected to just have a bit of a joke and a laugh around the mess table, and that does play an important part. You know, I think people's colleagues can provide huge support, but I think over the past decade, 15 years, there's a greater awareness of issues like PTSD and how that can affect people over a very long time, and is an illness and needs to be addressed more professionally, if you like. So there are counsellors in fire services up and down the country, including in London.
Do you know, it's funny, I didn't think I'd be reflecting on this today, but just as you were speaking, I remembered a chap I met last night who's a Chelsea pensioner. I was at a carol service for the charity Combat Stress, who provide precisely the sort of support for ex-military that you've just been describing for firefighters, and you know, he was in the autumn of his years. He was an old fella and a Chelsea pensioner in the full regalia, and talking about how 2 years ago this charity saved his life. He'd spent 20 or 30 years since leaving the military, angry without knowing why, depressed without knowing what that meant. 2 marriages had broken down, he'd alienated his children, and he'd reached what he pretty much considered to be the end of the line. And then this charity Combat Stress stepped in and provided help that he described to me last night as having saved his life. It's these conversations that address, as his name was Michael, actually, just to say hello to him. He used the word macho. The sense that macho-ness or machismo somehow is the opposite end of the scale to asking for help is a really dangerous perception, isn't it?
Yeah, and I do think, as I say, that I think there's a place for people just talking informally. One thing that I think we find in talking to colleagues in other parts of the world in the fire service, that actually people do want people who understand what they're talking about. So firefighters playing a role in that counselling process, if we want to call it that. Maybe they don't use those terms all the time, but it's talking through some of the issues that people might have faced, and that first-hand knowledge of the sort of experiences firefighters or others have been through, I think, really helps.
What I'm bearing in mind the inquiry is underway, and also the sort of political side of things is still very fluid. But as the General Secretary of the FBU, what questions would you like to see answered about the firefighting element of that night?
I think the think it's very deep. You know, so the press have concentrating on issues like cuts. I mean, that's something that needs to be looked at. But you mentioned earlier about the decisions that have been made are political decisions. So the question of how we build houses, how we put people in houses, how we regenerate estates and so on are political decisions, but that they all operate in a framework. And I think the question for us is what the framework we're operating in, whether it's in housing or in the fire service. In our view, the fire service itself has been subject to a great deal of fragmentation over the past 15 years, and we want to look at what impact that has had, not just on the firefighting on the night, but how we prepare for major events like Grenfell Tower.
Forgive me if this is an inappropriate question, but can you see things that you'd like to have had in place for the brigade 6 months ago that weren't?
I think we can. I think we look back at what we've said for the past 15 years, and I think we can point to things that it's very hard to say something would have made a difference, but the question is, could it have made a difference? And there are things that might have made differences. I'm not talking about the firefighting operate on the night. I think it's very, I think people did an amazing job in impossible circumstances. But the question is about preparation. So this is about the fire safety regime, of how we're inspecting buildings, how we're enforcing regulations. What are those regulations? How the people doing those inspections are trained? How many of them are there? Things like that, as well as then the fire service planning for something on this scale, which, to be frank, people were not expecting.
When people talk about this being an overly regulated society, about health and safety having gone mad, as of course some columnists are keen to do, did you recognise any reality in those sort of observations?
Well, there are always stories in the press that you'd think, actually, yeah, that sounds a bit weird, but we're dealing in a life and death industry. That's the work that our people do. So when we talk about red tape, it actually is the difference between life and death. We've had those debates, including with central government, including in my time, where we've had to confront ministers and say, frankly, you don't know what you're talking about. So red tape, procedures and policies, clearly the people will depart from those, but they provide a guidance for how do you deal with a hazardous incident, an emergency, a fire or a terrorist attack, or whatever it is, in the safest and most effective way. So that's, some people will call that red tape. We call it being professional.
Useful distinction. Some of the bereaved, and indeed some of the survivors, have been a little bit critical of the response on the night, the sort of moving of families up the building, and some of the sort of confusion perhaps about why, for example, big cranes weren't in place or helicopters couldn't do more. How do you sort of negotiate that as a firefighter? Because one of the things I learned from the clinical director of the psychiatric response from this is that a firefighter's post-incident difficulties can sometimes be more about not having been able to do more than about the things that they actually saw and witnessed. It's not a survivor's guilt, but it's a guilt that they couldn't do more, and however logical it is to explain to them that they physically couldn't have done more, that I'm told that this is something that they often take away. So the criticism must exacerbate that.
Yeah, I think that sort of comment has been made to me and reported to me a lot over the past 6 months, that people, one, they did see horrific scenes and they experienced horrific things, but also I think people will look, is there anything we could have done different that might have saved more lives? I think the firefighters on the night were placed, as I say, in an utterly impossible situation. In terms of talking to people in the community, I think people are right to ask questions, including of the London Fire Brigade. It's absolutely within their right. All we can do is try and answer. So the London Fire Brigade doesn't have helicopters. There are no firefighting helicopters in the UK. So we need to just patiently answer those points. The cranes, none of the cranes would, highest reach appliances would not have got to the top of Grenfell Tower. Other appliances may have made a difference, but we need to just be very methodical, careful, and answer the questions that people raise.
And it's helpful to reflect that some of the more troubling tales that emerged in the immediate aftermath, some of the things that have subsequently turned out not to be true, it's perfectly understandable how sometimes the story can be halfway around the world before the truth has had time to get its trousers on.
Absolutely. So the helicopter story, for example, is one of those. And the London Fire Brigade I remember them doing a trial a long time ago on helicopters, but there is no helicopter in the London Fire Brigade. All we can do, as I say, is tell that to the local community and hopefully people will then begin to reflect on how did that story start, and as you say, it answers it. It just you have to calmly answer the questions that people have.
The Metropolitan Police, the head of the Met, said yesterday in fact, that the criminal investigation is unlikely to be completed until 2019 at the very earliest, and could in fact take years. Presumably firefighters understand why better than almost anybody else does, because of the scale of the job and the difficulty of sifting through the evidence, and that's not a figure of speech in this case, is it? It's actually a physical description of what goes on. There
is a huge job to be done in terms of investigating this. I think I was at the procedural hearing for the inquiry this week. I suppose the question that the public inquiry rather than the criminal investigation's got to look at is, are there areas of the issues that need to be examined that can be looked at a bit sooner than that criminal investigation? Because I think there's clearly, while I understand the need for thoroughness in terms of criminal investigation, equally there's a clear call on the part of the community to find out what happened as quickly as possible. And I think a lot of firefighters will want to know that as well, what happened, what's the background to it, as quickly as possible. So we think that there are areas that the public inquiry can start to look at, regardless of what the Metropolitan Police are doing in relation to criminal investigations.
Are you confident that they will, or do you feel that some pressure has to be brought to bear, perhaps?
I can't judge what the chair of the inquiry panel is going to do, but I think there is clearly huge political pressure for them to proceed with that inquiry as quickly as possible in some areas. Clearly there may be areas where they can't go at this time, but there are areas we believe that can be start to be discussed.
Matt Rack, General Secretary of the Fire Brigades Union, many thanks indeed for your time this morning. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, live from the Maxilla Social Centre, which one of my sources in the area told me was under threat from redevelopment. I'm delighted to report that, having spoken to the charming fellow who runs the place, that tale appears to have been exaggerated. They're here for the foreseeable, and we're here until 1 o'clock. If you'd like to join us, the number you need is 0345 6060 973. Live today from the Maxilla Social Centre in North Kensington, from which one can see the shell of Grenfell Tower. And in a moment we'll cross live to St Paul's, where a memorial service is about to begin. But I just, because I know many of you listening follow these things as closely as I do, but the strange thing is, what changes when you get here? So I have, over the last couple of months, on occasion wondered whether we should have a chat about what should happen to the building. And it's felt inappropriate, or it's felt wrong, that question. I have to tell you that being here again today, it doesn't feel wrong anymore. And one of the things that is likely to happen in the next 6 months, as the police site investigation concludes, the tower is expected to be handed back to Kensington and Chelsea Council, which means, of course, that a lot of attention will turn to what should be done with that charred shell. It's one of the things about which I spoke yesterday to the clinical director of Grenfell, the man who's overseeing the sort of psychiatric and psychological response. You can hear that interview later in the programme, but it's also something that perhaps we should be talking about more. If you are living in view of this building, what do you think should happen to it? And I think, I don't know, you may disagree with me on this, because it would exclude me from the conversation if I was listening and you were presenting today. I'd wonder whether the opinion of anyone other than people who actually do live in the environs matters. Some food for thought. LBC's Lucy Hoff is at St Paul's, where, as I mentioned, that memorial service is about to occur. Lucy, what's going on? What's the feeling?
Extraordinarily powerful scenes here. You can probably hear the church bells ringing behind me. They started ringing the bells of St Paul's about 5 minutes ago as people are making their way into church. We've seen residents making their way and hugging as they walk up the stairs, and emergency services. There's been fleets of police officers, paramedics in uniform, and just now about a dozen police officers made their way in formal uniform, and the small crowd that's gathered here started applauding. So as you can imagine, really powerful scenes as this service was about to get underway. It kicks off at 11 a.m. this morning, and we're expecting the Prime Minister Theresa May to be arriving shortly, as well as members of the royal family, Prince Charles and Prince William. But the focus really here is the residents, the survivors and the bereaved families, many of whom have already arrived here this morning and made their way into the church. And you can really feel the sense of community and how significant a morning this is for those who lost their lives, lost their their homes 6 months ago today.
The majority of whom, of course, remain in emergency accommodation, which means they'll be celebrating their Christmas in hotel rooms. 54 households in temporary accommodation and 45 now in permanent. But these sorts of concerns are being set aside today, Lucy.
I think to an extent they are, but I think it's also it's a moment to really see what progress has been made in the 6 months since the fire. And I think many would agree, we know that there are more than 100 families still in temporary accommodation, only 42 that have got permanent accommodation. So this is a chance both for the community to come together, but also to address the ongoing problems that are still going on 6 months later, 6 months after many of these people lost everything, and they're still not able to completely move on with their lives.
Lucy Hoff, live from St Paul's. Many thanks indeed. Just a sort of journalistic note. You know how I feel about the side of my profession that essentially dedicates itself, whatever the story may be, to asking how we can use it to enrage people who don't know a great deal about it. You know how shocked I've been to see Grenfell fall into that category. I've mentioned it to you many times. If you'd asked me a year ago whether a tragedy such as this one would fall foul of the sort of rabble-rousing and provocation that accompanies almost every other news story in this country at the moment, I would have said no. Absolutely nobody would attempt to use the fact that these people are seeking suitable housing or that these people have had their lives destroyed. Nobody would use that to turn citizen against citizen, resident against resident. We know, sadly, that it is to be filed under precisely that banner. Here is another story. 71 people dead, 18 children, but still some people in this profession will attempt to use it as an attempt to divide us. What that service at St Paul's today reminds us all of, because of course it's attended by everybody from the heir to the throne and the Prime Minister right down to some of the people who will have lost friends and family that night and had precious little by way of material possessions to begin with, that properly, in a civilised society, tragedies like this should unite everybody. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. A couple of people responding to that clip I played you earlier of the call from Adrian, the firefighter. That because the inquiry is unfolding, people who found or even felt compelled to call on that day after, as the fire still burned, are not allowed to talk to us until the inquiry is complete. If they were on the scene, then that it could indeed compromise investigations. So I just want to play you the whole thing so that you get an idea of, because 6 months feels both like an eternity and like the blink of an eye. As you look at the building, you struggle, if you know this area as I do, you struggle to remember what it was like before, and yet at the same time, it feels like it's always been there. And it was in the immediate aftermath of the reports. It was on that first morning after the fire occurred that the truly unprecedented nature of what was unfolding began to emerge. And for me, this call from Adrian was a crucial part of that process.
I picked up the phone today, James, because I'm a serving firefighter and was a part of the initial attendance on the job last night. Yesterday morning, should I say. My crew was mobilised at about 2 a.m. It was a 40-pump fire at the time. And on arrival, what we saw was something from a movie scene, mate, to be quite honest. It was just simply breathtaking and unbelievable. So we walked in through the crowds to join our colleagues, and it was just complete pandemonium. We had casualties being ferried left, right and centre, and we immediately got to work in very, very difficult circumstances. It's something that I pray to God that we never have to witness anything like that again, to be honest, mate. Some very harrowing stories, which I can't obviously get into on air. Of course. But, a lot of the guys have experienced a lot of stuff that will live with them for a very, very long time.
Even people like me who hold your service in the highest of regards, we forget that you've got normal days, even normal fires, incidents that perhaps you'll deal with similar circumstances on several occasions. But what became clear pretty quickly yesterday was that no one had seen anything like this before. None of you had.
Definitely not. I mean, we do high-rise jobs can be difficult. They are the worst jobs that we incorporate as firefighters, and they can be quite dangerous. But this fire did not behave as a high-rise job behaved. We know where it started, and to have that result so quickly in these circumstances is just unbelievable. There's definitely something gone seriously wrong here. I don't want to compromise myself by telling you exactly what I feel, because the brigade are obviously going to conduct a full investigation. But this is not how high-rise jobs behave, and it's just unbelievable. It's just really unbelievable.
You may not want to answer this question either, and my goodness, you don't have to. Did you feel on the ground that you were sufficiently equipped and crewed to do the best possible job?
To be honest, it's a difficult question to answer, because we've got a lot of our crews that were there. So we obviously know that we've had a lot of cuts at this moment in time. But one thing I will say is that we're having 40 pumps on this incident. If another major incident takes place, I know we would definitely be stretched because of our resources. So without trying to be too political and compromise myself in any way, the crews that were there, we did the best that we could with what we had.
Well, that I know without asking, that you did the best that you did with what you had. But the other question will hang over us for some time, I think. So you clocked off at 2 o'clock yesterday afternoon?
That's right, yeah.
When were you back on, or when are you back on?
Well, my crew left there at 2 a.m. We was one of the last Bridgewatch crews to leave, I believe.
2 p.m.
And we had to... 2 p.m, sorry, yeah. So we got there at 2 a.m. Some of the crews, I had a very good friend of mine that was at North Kent, and their crew was their initial, and they only left probably about an hour or two before us, so there were some seriously long shifts going on. Yeah. There was a lot of guys working incredibly hard and willing to put themselves on the line, even though at the point of exhaustion, because we knew that the work had to be done, and it's just like, look, this is what we're here for. So I left the incident at 2 a.m. and then we had a debrief at Paddington Fire Station. I don't think my crew returned back to Tooting until 6 in the evening. I had the night off, pre-booked the night off before, which I was contemplating taking out because I didn't like the fact that I was going to be away from my crew. My crew clocked back on at 8 o'clock, and they went through it. Unfortunately, the brigade kept certain crews away from it, not to have to attend. Right. But they had one under this morning, so the job continues. You know, the job continues regardless.
Me speaking to Adrian, who, as you heard, was a firefighter among the first on the scene 6 months ago when Grenfell Tower was ablaze, 24-storey building, of course, in the early hours of June the 14th, engulfed in flames originally sparked by a faulty fridge on the lower floors of the tower. Just to clarify as well on that question of what may happen to the scene, to the site after all the investigations are complete, the plan at the moment is to demolish it by the end of next year. The community is understandably adamant that they do not want the site built on by developers. Ideas of a memorial garden or a remembrance space have been suggested. And I think sometimes, again, the people who, for reasons that I don't think I'll ever understand if I live to be 250, people who approach a tragedy like this and think, how can I use it as an opportunity to berate the victims, have been asking, for example, why people attending that service at St Paul's today would have been uncomfortable to have some Conservative members of Kensington and Chelsea Council alongside them. The answer, I presume, is known to people who ask vile questions like that, but they pretend they don't know the answer, so I shall share it with you in case you don't know the answer. The answer is that this community had been warning for months, even years, that they believed cuts and inadequate spending were creating an environment in which a tragedy like this could occur. You'll remember that blog by the Grenfell Action Group almost predicted to the letter the tragedy that unfolded that night, and the warnings were being given to the Conservative Kensington and Chelsea Council. So if there is any genuine confusion about why some of the people who saw their lives go up in flames, their family members die, and their homes destroyed forever, that didn't want some politicians present, the answer is pretty simple. They told those politicians that this might happen and they feel they were ignored. So don't read too much into the party politics of that, because the Prime Minister will, of course, be in attendance. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. The time now is 10:51. I see Diane Abbott has written a piece for the Huffington Post accusing the Prime Minister of failing to properly address the response and the need for rebuilding here in North Kensington. I'm broadcasting to you today live from the Maxilla Social Centre, which sits yards from the tower itself. The tower itself, if you haven't seen it, do you know, it's rather hard to properly express its profundity. Some people will have seen it from the road, from the motorway, as they make their way sort of past Westfield on that road there. Other people will have been closer. Every time I come here and every time I pass it, I expect a little bit of me to have started getting used to it, and I haven't. It's quite bizarre. I can't think of anything else like it. It is so anomalous. It is so in the skyline. It is so stark that there's no sense for me as a relatively occasional visitor of it becoming unremarkable, of it becoming normal. LBC's Rachel Venables has been covering the story since that night and has been back to the scene rather more often than I have. I wonder if that made sense to you, Rachel. It's still stunning.
It is, and I think it's when you see it at different times. So the first time I saw it at night, for example, when you see the dark outline up against, you know, the dark sky, and then you see the lit up towers next to it and you see what it should look like, that was a harrowing moment a few months on as well. When you see it early in the morning, late at night, when you get a glimpse of the forensic teams in their full blue and white suits peering at the windows from inside, and you get that glimpse every time you see it, it does hit you a little bit harder. But I think for many of the people who live here, sadly, it has become a part of life. It's become a part of their skyline.
You've been keeping in touch with some of the people that we met for the first time in the hours, actually, after the tragedy unfolded.
Yes. So 6 months on for many of them. When I spoke to quite a few of them in the last couple of weeks, actually, and spoke to them about how you're finding this 6-month anniversary, many of them just did the same thing. They sort of leant back and sighed and said, God, it feels like it was yesterday. But for them, so much has changed. We can hear, I think, some of their voices, their stories both of the night and how they're coping now.
I remember when I've heard some of the fire engines. And I thought it was normal because usually a lot of fire engines come.
About 1:30, I remember my dad running down the stairs and all I can hear him saying, your auntie's building's on fire.
I went to bed around 9:30, 10 o'clock, and at around 1:40, my son, Christopher, who just arrived next to the tower from work, telling me to get out of the tower as quickly as possible because the tower was burning.
We were in the fire station. It was in the middle of the night and got the call to a fire at Grenfell Tower.
So I jumped up, I opened the curtains and I can see the flames, and it looked like, in my eyes, like it was a film. It didn't look real.
It just felt like you was in a war zone. There was things exploding above your head and things whacking down on your riot shield.
I opened the curtains, I opened the windows, and I could hear, you know, that there was a lot of things going on. People screaming, people shouting.
The worst part, I remember, we would see people waving with their, waving white sheets from the window, like screaming, save me, save me, save me, help me, help me, help me. We're stuck in here, we're stuck.
And I'm trying to phone my auntie, I'm trying to just phone anybody just to make sure that, they're safe.
Listening to the fire and watching it spread, like someone had poured petrol down the side of the building. It literally fizzed and spread like just so fast.
I did not want to believe that we'd lost them. I didn't want to believe it. I couldn't.
I don't understand why I survived and so many other people died, but I need to know that everything I'm doing is in memory of these people, to make sure that the right things are done.
And the anger, because it wasn't supposed to be.
I do avoid looking at it. I do avoid going anywhere in that area because I don't want to see it.
Any little thing reminds me of Grenfell's. You get called to a fire, or you get called to a tower block, and you're straight back to Grenfell, yeah.
I just try to not remember anything. It's just very scary if you look at it.
I want to see people being held accountable for what happened that night. I want to see the people who escaped from that tower being housed in places they want to go. 6 months ago they were traumatised and they deserve every little bit of help that needs to be given to them.
Rachel Venables reporting, though not reporting, collating that collection of voices of people whose lives changed forever that night. The memorial service at St. Paul's is just about to start, of course. 11 o'clock is on the horizon. Lucy Hoff is there for LBC. Presumably, Lucy, everybody is present and correct now.
Yes, we've just had a flurry of the big names that we knew were going to be attending this morning. The young royals, William, Kate and Prince Harry, have just made their way into the church. A fleet of cars went by that looked as though it may have contained the Prime Minister, but it looks as though she's gone in the back entrance, which is unsurprising given that she may be expecting a fairly frosty reception here this morning. We've seen so that the Prince Charles and Camilla also have just arrived in the last few minutes. So it looks like all those big significant names that were set to be here this morning have now arrived, and the service will be taking place in just under 5 minutes' time. And it'll be, of course, a multi-faith service to remember the 71 that lost their lives 6 months ago. It's been co-organised by members of the local community, and afterwards this afternoon we're going to have a silent march to remember those 53 adults and 19 children that lost their lives on June the 14th.
And I will provide more details of that later in the programme. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. You can tell that we're live, can't you, by the background sound effects. We will continue with our examination and recollection of that night imminently. If you're wondering why Theresa May have expected a frosty reception, Lucy Hoff there, speculating somewhat, but it seems a reasonable speculation. You should be reminded that in June the Prime Minister offered, indeed pledged, that all the families affected would be rehoused within 3 weeks. It is, as we've discussed, a much more complicated project than perhaps she realised at that time. But it is, I think it's moot to remind you that the independent, and it's crucial that word, Grenfell Task Force report published recently criticised the council for its slow rehousing, for its lack of empathy and its lack of emotional intelligence, something that we very much picked up on at the time. So when I began the programme by suggesting that there are two parallel paths here, the political and the personal, that thought's clarifying now slightly as we continue with the programme. And the political response, it seems to me, still is subject to valid criticism. Indeed, you do sometimes wonder whether tragedies in the past that have taken decades to be properly investigated, whether that process of investigation has been hampered by the demonisation of the victims. One thinks most obviously of Hillsborough, of course, and the Sun newspaper's attempt to paint the people who were there that day as somehow responsible for the tragedy. Very good morning to you. It is just after 11 o'clock and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where to mark the 6-month anniversary of the most devastating blaze in modern British history, we come to you live today from the Maxilla Social Centre, which threw open its doors that night, I should remind you, and has subsequently provided an epicentre of support and succour for the community. And I don't know what my key role is on a day like today, but I suspect that a large part of it is communicating to you the reality on the ground. If we could just work out a magic way of spreading empathy, of making everybody in the country realise that some of the political issues in place could potentially affect all of us, and the only way you can make sure that bad things don't happen to you, if you want to put a slightly more selfish spin on things, is by putting rules and regulations and precedents in place that protect everybody. It's why human rights legislation exists, and yet, of course, even something as simplistic as suggesting that the best way of protecting all humans is to protect all humans becomes controversial in the crucible of modern media. But I think another part of why we're here today is to communicate what life is like on the ground, and the environs of the tower are still very, very much resonating with remembrance. The tributes that were put up in the immediate days afterwards have not all survived, but a surprising number have. These would be everything from portraits of people who perished. Obviously, the perhaps most poignant observation to make about that is the fact that, God, I just registered this as I mentioned it to you, but last time we were broadcasting from here, the area still contained many calls for help in finding missing people. The posters, the phone numbers, the names, the family portraits were pinned to fences, and shop windows pretty much wherever you wandered around here. And I've only just noted, of course, while talking to you, that they're not there anymore, that the commemorations are, the photographs of people now known to have died are there, but I mean, that's what ripped my heart out last time I was here, the uncertainty that was just writ so large upon so many of those notices. So they've gone, but an awful lot remains. And things that weren't here last time I broadcast to you from this table, in fact, let alone this room, was the community support that's gone in. So you will see signs wherever you turn directing you towards the Grenfell Support Centre or towards charities that are on the ground doing work with survivors and with local residents. So you could be traumatised simply by living within a mile or 2 miles of this. You'll remember speaking to people who feared the impact of opening their curtains to see the tower where their own family members had died. That's part of the rehousing process. I'm not going to get cross with people who've been successfully persuaded to feel anything other than empathy and warmth towards the families affected. I'm just going to calmly explain to you why I think that you're wrong, and the reasons why the housing has become a much more slow-moving process than everybody would like it to have been. A manifest. You wouldn't want to move into a home that reminded you of the night that your last home burned to a cinder. You wouldn't want to be relocated to an area where you didn't know anybody, or your children would no longer be able to walk to school. You wouldn't want to be put in a place that had unpleasant echoes or a distinct inferiority to the place that you had left behind. I'm going to take this on my watch and continue for as long as anybody has to speak for the people who lost their homes that night, and to explain, because they don't get an opportunity to do so, to explain to people, perhaps being misled, being lied to by the usual disseminators of division and hatred, why the story is always more complicated than a tabloid headline would allow. And the best way perhaps to do that in the first instance is just to ask you how much effort you put into finding the place where you live now. Did you just close your eyes, put your hand in a hat, pull out a key, and then call it home for the next 30 years? Or did you actually expend quite a lot of emotional energy, quite a lot of intellectual energy, quite a lot of thought and contemplation on what was best suited to you and your family's needs? Because if you did the latter, that's all that these people are asking for the right to do. And if you're, again, persuaded by that rancid rhetoric of, oh, how dare they do this, or why don't they take whatever they want, or, oh, these people, they're taking the mickey, which, again, you can tell because I keep returning to it. I can't begin to understand the mindset that would put that into the public sphere. Remember, there are over 2,000 empty properties in this borough alone. Remember that Kensington and Chelsea Borough Council is considered by almost everybody in this area to have been complicit in a process of what could be charitably described as gentrification, but what is more accurately described as really just a sort of deportation. You'll know we spoke to people last time we were here who've had compulsory purchase orders put upon their former council houses, people who exercised the right to buy under that scheme, and would be given a sum of money £200,000 or £300,000 short of what they would need to buy the cheapest property on the new development put up where the council housing used to be, in deals that have been conducted in cahoots with private property developers. So please just understand the scepticism and the suspicion. If you had told somebody that you feared things done to your home had rendered it unsafe, and then you had been proved right, and you had also seen neighbours who'd lived in their homes for decades essentially forcibly removed by a compulsory purchase order and rendered completely unable to retain any sort of link to the corner of the capital in which they'd grown up, then you would be sceptical and cynical and a little bit suspicious of the same authorities telling you that you needed to dance to their tune on this occasion. I'm not making any apology for returning to this theme. It seems to me to be a matter of civilization, let alone simple empathy. And just to, again, bring home how easily this tragedy could have occurred in any one of myriad postcodes across the country, I'm going to play you some coverage of the night itself when my colleague Darren Adam was on air and began to take calls from eyewitnesses as the full scale of the tragedy began to emerge.
Let me bring you some breaking news. We're getting details this morning of what appears to be a very big fire in a block of flats in West London, in Shepherd's Bush. We've been told that it's the Grenfell Tower that's being affected this morning. We'll hear from Rashid in Ladbroke Grove, in sight of that fire at Grenfell Tower. And goodness me, I've just seen a picture of it just now. It would appear to be, what's that, a 15, 20-storey building? If this photograph is accurate, it would suggest that every floor is on fire. Rashid is in Ladbroke Grove, in that part of West London, and can see something of what has been happening. Rashid, good morning. What can you see?
Good morning. I'm just on St. Mark's Road, very close to Grenfell Tower now, and the whole Grenfell Tower is on fire. And I can smell the bad smell of plastic and fire.
Is there much from the emergency services there?
Yes, the fire, and there's about 20 fire engines going up there. This is tragedy, mate. This is disaster. It's just been renovated as well, but in the last month or so, the whole
It has. Well, we obviously want to find out as much as we can about this, and our thoughts are with anyone in that building. Our hope, of course, is that everyone has managed to get out. We are unclear about that at the moment, but we're going to try to bring you as much as we can. Rashid, thank you for that. Stay safe. Mohammed is a cab driver who's also seen what's happening. What can you see, Mohammed? What can you tell us?
You can see the building absolutely in fire. The whole building. I mean, it's 20 floors, and it's just terrible. I mean, it's unbelievable. I've never seen something like it. The trouble is, I mean, I think there's people that are stranded there. They're stuck there. You can see all the light on the windows. It's the flame. It's like, because the thing is, those buildings, it's the tallest building in West London, and you can see them from anywhere. I mean, you won't miss them. So you can imagine the whole building from the top floor, from the bottom, from the ground floor, all the way up to the top floor. There's not even one floor is missing, so the whole thing is caught fire.
And it has, as we're about to hear from someone else, spread incredibly quickly, as you can imagine. Mohammed, thank you for that this morning. Adam is in Notting Hill. Will be able to perhaps tell us what he saw when that started. Adam, good morning. Thank you for calling us. You were next to the tower when the fire started, is that right?
I wasn't next to it. I was about halfway up the building when it first started. It was already started. But I saw loads of people screaming, crying, running. It was a mess, really. But the services got there about 10 minutes after that.
And when was this, Adam? When did you notice or see this beginning to happen?
This was about at least 45 minutes ago, hour ago. Literally loads of people were around. I'm getting local people coming out of the houses crying, people running across, people panicking, thinking their families are still in the building.
Can you see now, as indeed the videos that we have seen would suggest, and the eyewitness reports also suggest, that this 24-storey building, that every single one of those floors is on fire?
Every single one's on fire, 100% from the bottom to the top.
All emergency services appear to be on the scene of a major fire at Grenfell Tower in West London, a 24-storey building, 120 homes in that tower block, and the entirety of the building, in the sense that every single floor is currently on fire. Christine in Latimer Road in West London, you live on the estate.
On the estate, yeah, there's 3 blocks that face this tower block, and actually I used to live in there when I was little, and the fire happened and we were able to move. But right now, Darren, all I wanted to say is that they've put new stuff on the outside of that building, like a refurbishment, and that's what I think is burning so quickly, because when there was fires in there before, it would be like contained to maybe that flat that the fire started in, and maybe the one above, maybe the one below, but nothing like this. It just looks like it's getting worse, Darren, and I don't know, you know, the fire brigade and everything that are downstairs, I don't know how they're thinking to tackle it, because it's just spreading. It's just really spreading now.
We do have the fire services currently trying to scale that burning building to spray water at the top of Grenfell Tower. How much difference that is going to make, how much difference that can make at this stage, is an open question. Amelia and Brian are also, I think, nearby. Thank you for calling. Whereabouts are you both?
Basically, we were driving out of central London when we saw the blaze. I think it started around 1:20, and then within 10 minutes, the fire spread like crazy to the top. It was a horrible thing to watch, to be honest.
There are some rescues taking place on lower floors on the other side. Let's go to John, who's in Paddington. John, thanks for calling us here on LBC. What can you see?
The whole building is engulfed
God help anybody who's there now. It just seems the whole building is engulfed. There's no way that they can rescue anybody on any of the high floors. Also, that the flames are so intense, there's nothing going to put this fire out anytime too soon. It's terrible to watch because, you know, there's lives are in danger here.
The Metropolitan Police, as of around 30 minutes ago, said they were aware of 2 people being treated at the scene for smoke inhalation. It would be beyond hopeful to hope that the injuries would be limited to simply 2 people with smoke inhalation this morning, given that 120 homes were in this tower block and given that the fire started at around 1 o'clock in the morning. Mustafa is at Ladbroke Grove, very close to what's been happening. What can you see? Morning, Mustafa.
Really, what I can see is really horrifying. I've never seen anything like it. The whole block is completely a furnace. The sides, the middle, I can even see the flats. Everything is gone. It's gone, mate. It's gone. I don't know if they can save it. I don't know. It seems like plastic is burning, you know, and it's like lumps stop falling out. And the middle, it's completely alight. So I don't think. I hope they can save as many people as they can. But
well, have you been able to see, with the evacuation underway, Mustafa, have you been able to see anyone managing to get out of the building, anyone being rescued from that tower block?
No, not at all. Not at all.
200 firefighters and 40 fire engines attending this tower block blaze. The fire, we understand, stretching from the 2nd floor to the top floor of the 27-storey tower that is Grenfell Tower on the Lancaster West estate in North Kensington. 120 homes in this tower, 120 individual flats. And according to an eyewitness to whom we spoke here on LBC earlier this morning, a blaze within 10 minutes.
My colleague Darren Adam there, broadcasting live 6 months ago as the Grenfell Tower tragedy began to be reported properly. Darren, of course, with you from 1 a.m. to 4 a.m. Every weekday morning, Monday to Friday. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. The time now, 18 minutes after 11. 6 months after the Grenfell Tower tragedy, and as many of the families affected and members of the royal family and the Prime Minister and others gather at St Paul's for a memorial service, we find ourselves back in the Maxilla Social Centre, which sits just a couple of 100 yards from the tower itself. The tower, of course, which remains a charred memorial to that night and to the lives lost. I'm sort of very clumsily cobbling together a plan for the future, for our future coverage of this. You'll know we made a promise on this programme to people affected by this tragedy never to look away. Is perhaps the best way of putting it. And as I allow myself a degree of disgust at some of the coverage that I've encountered of the story and of the survivors, I see little pieces falling into place. You remember when, and obviously the inquiry that's still underway regarding Hillsborough limits what one can say somewhat, but you'll remember how immediately after the Hillsborough tragedy, a sort of curious conspiracy of media and vested interests conspired to portray the people there that day. The truth was the front page on the Sun, and it turned out to be anything but. So there is a very real danger that the kind of coverage I've been discussing in very negative terms today could have an impact upon the success of the investigation. And if the public are successfully persuaded that the residents of Grenfell Tower are somehow undeserving of their sympathy, then the likelihood of that investigation, that inquiry achieving full results becomes diminished. I don't think it's deliberate, for the record. I don't think the people that try and make you cross about the fact that some of the survivors want to have a little time to decide where they want to live next. I don't think that the people who try and make you turn against the survivors because they wore headscarves or have long names, I don't think they are necessarily trying to keep the truth from coming out. I think they're doing what they always do, which is employing the most bovine of tabloid tactics to turn any story at all into an opportunity for division and hatred. So we'll just carry on fighting the good fight from the other side of the force. A lot of you have asked how Zoe Levac and her colleagues at Kids on the Green are getting on. Zoe, you'll remember, was here last time we were, and we were able, as a result of how powerfully she expressed herself, to provide quite a lot of help to the organisation, and including a shipping container, which I'm hoping will have become redundant in the interim, because there'll be a more permanent position in place. Rachel Venables went to meet her and to find out how Kids on the Green... Indeed, last time we were here, we weren't sure whether it would still be here 6 months after the fire. So let's find out, first and foremost, whether or not it is.
This is really the main hall where most of the activities happen, and the far side over here is where we tend to do our activities that are sort of physical, where the kids are running around. The unfinished room, it's going to be our art therapy room. So we've got a plumber coming in about half an hour to sort of continue working on it. So we're really trying to reach out to the adolescents in the community for the art therapy, because there's already quite a lot of art therapy happening with adults further down the road. Over here is kind of like our just our comfy area, really. So a lot of the chairs and the sofas that are in there are normally in here. So really it's just where the mums sit and chat. You can see over there, there's one of our counsellors is talking to one of our mums that's been quite affected by everything here. So we work with a team of trauma and grief counsellors all the time. So every single session we have at least 2 of them here. We have mental health first aid trained practitioners as well.
I'm 6. Hi, I'm Evie and I'm 6.
Tell me a bit about Kids on the Green. What's your favourite bit about coming here?
I was doing the hula hoop.
And do you know why Kids on the Green was set up? Do you know what it's for?
What?
After the fire, Kids on the Green happened so that you guys had a place to come to where you can be...
Wait, I know something.
Yeah?
Our friend Talene lives in that tower. Somebody left the fridge on for 1 minute in the middle of the night, and then fire starting happening.
And how do you feel when you see the tower?
Sad.
That's fair enough. But when you come here, you can feel happy and you can enjoy it.
Yeah. Simon says, tickle that girl's back again.
Hi, I'm Aaron and I'm 13 years old. What I remember is me waking up until, my mum waking me up at 2 a.m. saying there's a fire. And at first she thought it was like my school. Next we realised it's the tower straight next to it, Grenfell Tower. And like the first thing I think of was like my friends who live there. And I've got about 5 or 6 who go to my school. I'm not necessarily friends with each and every one of them, but I know all of them like fairly well. And yesterday was one of their birthdays, Miena. Happy birthday and rest in peace. And yeah.
Coming here then to Kids on the Green, does that help at all?
Really good, because it's just like a way for kids and adults to express themselves. They can chat, they can kids can meet new people, and they can just have fun and have a laugh.
What's the best bit of it for you then? What's the bit you look forward to the most when you come here?
All of it.
All of it. I have a feeling we may play that report by Rachel Venables out again before 1 o'clock today, just in case anybody was making a cup of tea or allowed themselves to get distracted. I'm joined now by Zoe Levac from Kids on the Green, and by her colleague Nigel Warwick, who works with a group called the Flying Gorillas, of which we will find out more imminently, because we're going to hit the news in a couple of minutes, so we'll bring you both back afterwards. Zoe, what's changed since we last saw you? My first thought would be that we heard laughter from those children, and you kind of put it there.
Yeah, I mean, everything's changed. We started with a blanket and a box of felt tips and a bag of footballs 6 months ago, literally.
This because, we should probably remind people, this because the what you might call the formal response or the official response didn't materialise.
No. There was nothing. It was all the community, 100%.
So there you were with your blanket and your balls.
Yep, and that was the day after the fire. And we've now moved into a warehouse space in Latimer, which is amazing. And yeah, we're rolling 4 days a week, hoping to move to 5 days a week in January if we can. It's very cold. We do need, I'm sorry to always do this, James, but if there is a roofer out there that will come and have a look at the leak in our roof, please, because we've been battling the elements to get the warehouse comfortable for everybody. It's a fantastic space, but it's a bit cold, but we're sorting the heating now. We've had so much help. There's too many people to thank. You know, we've just had so much help from people and organisations, may I add, not any official help.
Does that still surprise you?
Yes, it really does. I mean, we wouldn't be open, we'd be closed if it wasn't for... I mean, there's too many people to thank. We've had lots of individual donations and lots of volunteers helping to do things. But if I would like to say thank you to Love for Latimer, the DJ group that have kept the lights on, and the Fire Brigade Union, who recently donated to us as well. And those two substantial donations have literally kept Kids on the Green project going.
Is there I don't want to overcomplicate the issue, but is there a slight danger of the people we would expect to do this, the people who take our council tax offers most obviously, not stepping up to the plate because you stepped in so quickly? Or do you feel that if you hadn't done what you've done, nobody would have done?
That's a good question, and I think it's a question that we've all asked ourselves, but it's got to the point now where we just do for ourselves.
And long may it continue. We will we'll find you a roofer by 1 o'clock, or I'm a banana, all right? Okay. We will also return imminently to hear a little bit more from Zoe and from Nigel Warwick after the very latest news headlines with Simon Conway. It's 11:33. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where you know by now, I hope, that we're broadcasting live from the Maxilla Social Centre today. Just before the break there, Zoe Levac from Kids on the Green was telling us about the warehouse. So when we first met Zoe five months ago, they didn't even have a lock-up in which to put the equipment that was being donated. Listeners to this programme came to the rescue, provided her with a shipping container which became the original lock-up, and also with an awful lot of equipment. There was one bloke I'm still waiting to meet who drove all the way across London with a 4x4 full of footballs. But we need a little bit more help. We did put a couple of roofers in touch with Zoe after we spoke to her on the phone last time, and it's possible that the state of the roof on this warehouse that they're in put them off. Nobody's asking people to put in a 2-month shift or a multi-thousand-pound job for nothing. But there's a Christmas party on Saturday, and if it rains, Santa's going to get soaked. It really is that simple. And if you are in the business, if you are in the industry, and you think you might be able to help, just in the short term, to kind of work out why the water's coming in, and do something that prevents it from doing so for a couple of months or even a couple of weeks. If we could do it by Saturday, that'd be amazing, guys. james@lbc.co.uk is the email address that you need. We'll talk to Zoe a little more in a moment, but also with us today is Nigel Warwick, who was based in this area long before the tragedy and has been working with children from this postcode and nearby for a long time now with a group called Flying Gorillas. Nigel, I should also add that by one of these astonishing twists of fate, you're also the stepson of the amazing woman that taught me English at a school in the middle of North Yorkshire 30 years ago.
Attempted to, anyway.
Attempted to teach me English. Yes, I hope she's not too embarrassed by the results. But before we speak specifically about the Grenfell reaction, tell me a little bit about the Flying Gorillas.
Well, as you say, we've been working in the area for 20 years now, so some of the children that we used to work with are now grown up and actually work with us as volunteers, teaching assistants, and in one case a performer. The work is dance and live music for children. The current show is classical music and breakdance. A lot of our performers are from mainland Europe because our main funder is the Creative Europe programme of the EU.
Do you know, we were trying to get through the show today without mentioning Brexit, and you've just driven a coach and horses through that noble ambition, but quite rightly on this occasion. So now this is interesting, isn't it? Because it was one of your liaisons in Brussels that noticed in the immediate aftermath of the fire that your business address had the same postcode as the tragedy she was reading about, and she got in touch with you almost immediately.
That's right. It was our officer in Brussels. A matter of days afterwards, as you say, she spotted London W11 and called initially to ask if we were okay. and then to discuss how their unit, if there's anything they could do to help. And what they are doing is organising and paying for 4 or 5 young classical musicians from different European countries. They're competition winners in their own country, so they're really kind of world class. They'll be coming over next April, and we'll be doing our show with classical music and breakdance at Zoe's venue, which we were just discussing in the Crow's Nest, as well as all the local primary schools.
And just give me an idea of what the children derive, and try not to be unduly modest, if you know what I mean by that. What do the children derive from this sort of, I don't know what the correct phrase would be, a discreet provision of help? I know you described it as when you emailed me. It's a sort of soft therapy, perhaps.
Yes, it really does have an impact, positive impact, on the mental health crisis that we're all facing in this area. Of course, we can't claim to be medical professionals in any way, but the provision of fun, positive, energetic, creative activities like breakdance, engaging in classical music, trapeze sessions, it provides a distraction, it provides a sense of normality, and it allows people to engage with what you might call the well part of themselves. And what that can do is alleviate the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. And once the symptoms are alleviated, then people could become more susceptible to treatment. There's, I think, especially, I don't know if it's right to say, but people from different cultural backgrounds may be more shy to ask for help, prefer professional help.
Yes.
And so, just, I think all I'm saying it can do is provide some relief and make people more amenable to treatment.
And all art takes one out of oneself. That's what it's designed to do. So I suppose that the harder it is being oneself, the more important this kind of artistic intervention becomes. It's going to sound like I'm banging a very personal drum on this one, but I think it merits a mention that we have heard a lot about how slow the local authorities and indeed national government was to respond. Not so the European Union. I know one of your participants, Yusuf, who's 9 years old, has picked up on this.
Yes, that was very sweet. That was Yusuf, who was on the green with us during the breakdance session. He said something like, well, it's nice to know that people who are really far away think about us.
People who are really far away are thinking about us. 60% of the support that Flying Gorillas arts activities in North Kensington has received since 2007. And of course, long before Grenfell, you were working with children, disabled people, elderly people, and many others. 60% of that support came from those EU transnational funds. Do you have any idea what's going to happen after Brexit?
That's a nobody knows question. I think what we do know is that if there's no deal and the UK crashes out, then there will be no question of us having access to the transnational funds. If there's some sort of compromise or backtracking, then there's a good chance that there will be some sort of eligibility to the 3 big ones, which are Creative Europe for culture, Erasmus for education, and Horizon 2020 for scientific research.
And finally, Nigel, I know that some of the children that you work with were in the tower that night, but luckily managed to escape and are safe. But of course, some of their teachers, friends, and family members did not. Children seem, and I don't want to sound trite when I say this, but listening to the kids on the green clip earlier, which Rachel reported on, kids seem perhaps to be better at processing this stuff than adults are.
They are better at processing trauma, certainly in the short term. We had a little boy in the school that's very close to here, St Francis of Assisi. Last time we did a show there, we all have the T-shirts that have the Grenfell heart on the back, and 9-year-old boy came up and said to me, "Why have you got Grenfell on your T-shirt? That was last year."
So he's moved on.
Well, for him it was last year, because last year he was year 4, this year he's year 5.
Oh, bless him. And there's a sort of, I don't know, an acceptance of stuff. And also you don't realise how extraordinary it is, perhaps, if you're young and haven't been around for 50 years and only seen something like this happen once. Please God, nobody ever sees it again. Zoe, it occurs to me that we took a little bit for granted for people who may not have been listening last time you were here. You sprang up almost organically the day after, the morning after the fire, and have subsequently gone from strength to strength. So who comes to Kids on the Green, and what do they do when they get there?
The Kids on the Green is for the whole of the community in Latimer. It's a provision that seeks to engage the family unit rather than just the children. We're here just as much for the parents as we are for the kids. So we try to create an environment that's supportive, and it's the best way to describe Kids on the Green is a fusion between therapies and play. So obviously we have a very strong mental health team that work with us around the clock every session, but we also have lots of amazing arts practitioners, so the children can engage in meaningful arts-based activities, anything from circus to music, dance. Nigel's done a lot of dance with us, whilst the parents can sit and perhaps have a really informal chat with the counsellor, or just chat with each other. And we've been able to bring lots of the community together who perhaps wouldn't have known each other before. I mean, that's something that a lot of the parents have said to us, is Kids on the Green has given them an opportunity to get to know their neighbours and members of the community that they perhaps wouldn't have met before or socialised with before. And the children, they come and they play and they have fun. And I think what Nigel said about creating a distraction, that's really what we've tried to do. We've tried to replace some of those horrible memories that we know would have been inevitable, yes, with some good ones. And
it becomes, I suppose, part of these children's lives in a way now, after 6 months, rather than something out of the ordinary and a sense of relief at the time. I hope you don't mind me mentioning this, but a colleague and I were commenting during the break on how much better you look than the last time we saw you, because you were frazzled, not to put too fine a point on it.
I don't think there was sleep for, I think when I met you before, it was 3 weeks, 4 weeks.
It was a month, yeah, it was 4 weeks.
It was a month afterwards.
Yeah.
It was
and
just...
You were all over the place, but you were still doing this astonishing job. But you still shed a little tear when we were listening to the clip there from Kids on the Green. How do you look after yourself?
Well, we have clinical supervision now. We didn't for a long time.
Yes.
Now we do. So we have a wonderful lady that comes and does that, and she's there for anyone, any staff or volunteer member from Kids on the Green, and we do that once a fortnight. But we talk to each other, and I think that's really important.
Yes, absolutely. How can people listening? We're getting what's the collective noun for roofers? Does anyone know? We're getting a few roofers in touch. I'll stress again, we're not looking for anybody to give up, 2 weeks or 2 months of their livelihood and come out massively out of pocket. We're just looking for someone who might be able to pop down. We'll do all the liaison to this corner of London, North Kensington, Ladbroke Grove, not Notting Hill, if you're not familiar with the area. It's in that sort of postcode, and just have a look at why the room in which the Kids on the Green kids are supposed to be having their Christmas party on Saturday will be more like a fish tank if we cannot find a way of temporarily plugging this hole in the roof. So email me, james@lbc.co.uk, or ring in and speak to Jacob, and we'll take your details. We won't hold you to anything, or just try and find out how plausible it is that we can fix this stuff up. But if other people listening, Zoe, want to make a contribution to the work that you're doing, how can they go about doing that?
At the moment, we do have a U-Caring site, but there seems to be a couple of technical issues with that at the moment. So we have a community Kids on the Green account. So if people contact me by email or on the Facebook page, send us a message. Facebook is Kids on the Green W11, so you can send me a message on there, and then we can message you back the account details. Or you can email me, which is zoe@kidsonthegreen.com, and again we can let you know how you can make a direct donation.
Fantastic stuff. Zoe Levac, thank you very much indeed. And Nigel Warwick as well from Flying Gorillas, thank you. Will you give my love to your stepmom?
I will indeed.
Thank you very much. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. The time now is 11:46. 10 minutes to 12 is the time. This from Neil. Thank you, mate. I was hoping James O'B would give me the lowdown on last night's EU vote. Instead, he's shining a massive light back onto the Grenfell Tower tragedy. Please tune in or listen on catch up. I've been moved to tears. We must keep this story alive. Indeed, we must. And to that end, yesterday I spoke to the clinical director at the Grenfell Tower NHS Mental Health Response Team, Dr. John Green. He's head of psychology services for the Central and North West London NHS Foundation Trust. Been involved with many health emergencies in the past, such as the Ladbroke Grove rail crash, which occurred just around the corner from where we are now. So I began with that in mind by asking him if he'd ever dealt with anything comparable to the Grenfell tragedy.
So, I mean, all of these major incidents present particular problems, and they all present unique problems, but the scale of this one is absolutely enormous. It's the biggest major incident, I think, since perhaps Aberfan in the 60s.
And the problem with a conversation like the one that we're having now is that we seek, journalists seek, generalisations would be a little unfair, but we seek perhaps solutions to a myriad of problems, whereas presumably of the hundreds of people that you're seeing, no two are the same.
No, I mean, I think everybody has different issues, they've got different lives and they've had different experiences, but I suppose that you see some similarities. Some of the problems that come up are similar in people, but yes, I mean, we treat everybody as an individual. You have to do that.
So 936 adults in urgent need of post-traumatic stress disorder treatment. What makes it urgent? How does that qualify?
Okay, so well, there's post-traumatic stress disorder, but there are also other psychological problems that arise as well, so that's just one part of what we're doing. It's very important to treat these things because they get in the way of people's everyday life, of their ability to enjoy life and also their ability to function at work or you know, with family. And so it's very undermining, so we want to get to people and actually treat them.
And what does treatment involve ordinarily? Obviously, again, there's not going to be any two prognoses that are identical.
If we're talking about post-traumatic stress disorder, then the treatment is lengthy, but the outcomes are very, very good. So the treatment is psychological, it's psychological treatment. Medication is much less important, and our front line of treatment is psychological treatment. And we would expect most people who are treated to recover from post-traumatic stress disorder and from the other conditions that we're treating.
1,800 people seen by the Trust since June. That suggests that your resources are up to the task. There were some fears in the immediate aftermath that people were not receiving the help that they so clearly required.
Well, we've spoken to a lot more people than that. We've spoken to over 4,000 in the area, and we have teams at the moment going out, knocking on doors, doing screening, talking to people, finding out that they're okay, and we have outreach teams engaging with people. So not everybody is ready to go into post-traumatic stress disorder treatment, and we're providing support to them. And some people are saying, well, you know, I'd like to postpone that until I've got my housing sorted out, or until I've sorted other things out. So we're kind of keeping in contact with them as well. So it's a large task. The answer is that we had to build up our resources very quickly. We've brought in therapists from all over the place. We've hired a lot of additional staff. We built up a big outreach team. We had to do that because of the sheer scale of the event at Grenfell.
Forgive me if this is an inappropriate question, but would you be in a position to tell me that you weren't getting the support and the resources that you needed to do this job, or would your role involve putting a brave face on things?
I am well capable of saying if things are not there.
Need to check. We haven't met before.
Yes, no, I don't. I'm not inclined to sit there while you know, people have problems and then say nothing. No, you know, it's not just issues around money, but it's also issues around getting highly qualified staff. We wanted the best possible staff that we could to work with people in the area. It's not just the Tower residents students, but of course people around as well. And of course the very best people, they start out, they're busy already, and you start to recruit them. It takes time for them to run their caseloads down and come over to you. So we're building up all the time.
And in some sense, then, it never ends, then, this project, task?
No. I mean, it's clearly going to be a long process, and we're going to be around for a long period of time. I mean, as the NHS, I hope we're going to be here for many years.
Yes, of course.
But obviously, it will be over a long time scale, because the treatment takes a long time. But also, even once you've treated people for post-traumatic stress disorder or the other conditions, they often need more support just to get back into a normal life. And of course, we've still got people out in hotels at the moment, so not everybody's settled.
The report yesterday noted that the 6-month anniversary could have a difficult resonance for people, and also that Christmas coming up could see people, like, forgive me if I use the wrong language, but could see people have some sort of relapse or an echo of the horrors of that night. Is that?
Yes, I mean, I think the one of the things about Grenfell is there are many anniversaries and many issues which will bring the issue to mind. So, I mean, that's one of the other factors, because we've got not only the anniversary, but we've also got inquests, we've got a public inquiry, and possibly in the future criminal prosecutions. So all of those keep the issue alive. It's never
and affects
settled.
Recovery, because it would, for some, presumably, it would feel like a reminder, just as they were managing to control or contain their own memories.
Yeah, and I mean, I think we're well aware of that fact. We're very mindful of that. So it is important to bear in mind the fact that you have to keep in contact. You have to keep on to this, because yes, it is a reminder, and people can be knocked back, but hopefully you can minimise that knockback.
And do they have such a thing as an emergency provision if somebody is because I have some experience of mental health issues and the peaks and the troughs. If one of the people affected finds themselves near the bottom of a trough, can they get help immediately?
Yes, I mean, we have an outreach team, so and you know, if there's an immediate emergency, someone goes out from the outreach team. So I mean, that does happen, and generally that seems to work very well.
Presumably, there's a different set of tools needed therapeutically for dealing with children as opposed to adults.
Yes, I mean, children there's a range of children. So older children tend to be very similar to adults. Obviously, they transition into adults, and they seem to have a similar presentation and some of the same techniques used to treat them. But for very young children, you sometimes get a different manifestation of trauma. They respond differently, but also they're embedded in a family, so you have to work with the family as well and try and find solutions that way.
What are you looking for then with children, particularly in the context perhaps of a sense that something might be wrong, but families not having the professional expertise or the understanding of the issues to know what help would look like? So what do your colleagues and you look for in children? What are signs of potential trauma and trouble?
Well, I mean, I think one of the most obvious things is the child has changed their behaviour. They've just changed. So you get a child that becomes withdrawn, becomes fearful, maybe having nightmares, maybe distressed in a way that they weren't before. And so we're obviously, as we're going round and screening adults and talking to adults, we're also inquiring about children, we're seeing about children. We've got a big programme working with schools, because that's another area where children can be picked up if they're struggling. And, you know, we work with community groups who work with children as well. Over the summer, when the schools weren't actually working, then we were working with local groups, play groups and football groups and all sorts of things, just to make sure that we could keep in touch.
The community response, which is part of what you've just described, has, one hesitates to use the phrase silver lining, obviously, but it's been a rare example of something uplifting about this whole horrible story. The way that the people in the area's organisations, volunteer groups have sprung up has been profoundly impressive. What sort of impact would that have upon the mental health issues of the people in the area?
I think that's been tremendously helpful. I mean, there's been, as you say, a tremendous community response. We work very closely with the local community. We work with third sector organisations, but with residents groups and all sorts of things, and they've been enormously helpful as far as we're concerned. It would be very difficult to mount a response of this scale and this intensity without actually working with people. So that's been absolutely crucial. And I think also that community support's been very helpful, because I think that it has helped individuals a lot who otherwise would have struggled more than they have done.
How much of it, and this is where I may sound a little facile, but how much of it is visual? It's the fact that these people have seen things that nobody should have to see, and how much of it is more complicated than that?
Well, it's both.
Yes.
So there were lots of people. I mean, the tower is visible for most of North London.
Yes.
And a lot of people in the immediate area, they saw.
Would you rather it wasn't still there? Just on a purely sort of therapeutic level.
Well, there's been a discussion about whether or not to shroud it,
yes.
And I think that is likely to that looks as though that may well go ahead. There've been mixed feelings about whether that's a good idea. Some people saying, well, you know, that's kind of hiding the problem and hiding and other people saying, well, every time I pop up my curtains, I see it. It's a reminder. I think it probably will be shrouded, and I think that'll probably be helpful. My understanding is at the moment that eventually decisions will have to be made about what to do about the tower, but of course that's also something where there needs to be discussions with the local community. So this is a rather different situation from, say, terrorist incidents, where you get a bomb, as you did in the London Underground, very terrible. It tends to be over a short period of time, obviously, although there's an aftermath. This was a fire that lasted a very long time, but also usually in terrorist incidents, the people who are involved, they don't tend to be interconnected. They don't know each other socially. In the area around Grenfell, what makes a difference is that lots of people knew someone in the tower. It's a very closely connected, interconnected community. And so it's not just the people who actually witnessed what was going on or were there on the day, but it's also people who are socially connected into the tower and that area around it, that who've been affected. That's what pushes up the numbers.
Is it dispiriting work because the scale is so huge?
No, I don't think it is dispiriting. To me, it's not dispiriting. I know it's dispiriting. It's important for us to do it. We think it's important work, and so it has its difficulties. It's obviously very difficult. It's got lots of challenges, but it has to be done, and we have to do it as well as we possibly can.
I don't want to appear prurient, but could you describe some of those specific challenges, some of the worst cases that you've encountered?
We've heard, my colleagues obviously and myself, we've heard terrible stories of people escaping through the smoke and the fire, and people being aware that there were people trapped in the tower, and so those things have been, they are quite distressing to listen to, so there are many people, and there are lots of people in the surrounding area who've lost someone, and of course it's not just the people in North Kensington. We're also dealing with people who are bereaved, who are outside North Kensington, but they just happen to have relatives in the tower, so there's obviously quite a bit of distress in people who've lost someone.
How do you gauge when the treatment is working?
Well, I think the thing is that, obviously it's 6 months in, but also we're looking forward further into the future than just 6 months. And actually, we're not just looking at treating people for post-traumatic stress disorder. We're thinking about what would be better in the future. What I'd like to see in North Kensington is that somehow it's better than it was before the fire.
Dr. John Green there, the clinical director for Grenfell, talking to me about the astonishing work undertaken by him and his team. It's 3 minutes after 12. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. My apologies for hitting that last news bulletin a little late, but we are not in our usual habitat today. I'm coming to you live from the Maxilla Social Centre, which sits just a couple of 100 yards away from what remains of Grenfell Tower, and in the unlikely event that you're not aware of what remains of Grenfell Tower, it is a 24-storey block of burnt brick, really, burnt concrete. It remains like a charred shell looming over the whole of this corner of our capital city as a testament to what happened that night. But of course, since that night, stories have moved both personal and political in all manner of different directions. You will allow me to continue to fight this bizarrely necessary rearguard action against people in my profession who consider the bereaved, the survivors, and even the dead that night to be somehow yet another wedge with which we can seek to drive divisions between each other for the crime of wearing a headscarf or having a long, unpronounceable name. The argument is that these people don't deserve our sympathy, which is the only possible way in which I can understand how anybody could be feeling anything but supportive towards those who will be spending their Christmas in temporary accommodation, in hotel rooms, even by then, of course, nearly 7 months after the event. I'm joined now by Pilgrim Tucker, who's a housing campaigner whose company we enjoyed last time we were here, about exactly 5 months ago. And before we speak to Pilgrim, I'll just play you a clip of Councillor Elizabeth Campbell, leader of Kensington and Chelsea Council, talking to LBC yesterday about this issue of housing for victims.
When we started off, we thought we were rehousing 138 households. We are up to 210. And this is all for perfectly good reasons. You know, we all know relationships sometimes break down, and we also know that if you're living in a house or flat with 3 generations, and now you've got the opportunity for everyone to have their own flat, for Granny to have her own space, and your adult children to get their own space, you to get your own space, you will do that, and fair enough. I think in these circumstances, when you remember what people have actually been through, and that some of them have actually lost sort of wives or children or spouses and neighbours, I think it behoves us to be generous in this case, absolutely. Everybody who's in a hotel has had an offer of alternative accommodation, be it private rented sector, permanent home, or even a serviced apartment. 45 people have already moved in, and about another 45, 50 have already have accepted offers of permanent accommodation. What we've done is we've been buying flats and houses at the rate of 2 a day, about 2 a day. By Christmas, we will have 300, and then we'll stop, and then we'll say, right, now we've got overage, we've got a choice. So there'll be a choice for people to take, and then it will be up to them to decide where they want to live and move on. And for some people it'll be a bit slower, some people it'll be a bit faster. And for us it's about the individual, it's about the family, it's not about moving people from one side of a balance sheet to another so we can tick a box. And I think we have to win back trust by our deeds, by our words. And I come back to the fact that we're rebuilding people's lives. You can only do that if you're back in your own home with your own front door. And we're going as fast as we can. We're spending huge amounts of money. It's not about the money, it's about the homes, but we're still spending 235 million. And then beyond that, I think it's a question of actually talking to people in the area, consulting with them, making sure that we understand what they want for the future, and then going with them to do that.
Councillor Elizabeth Campbell speaking to LBC yesterday, the head now of Kensington and Chelsea Council. We are, by dint of the ongoing inquiries and indeed the possibility of criminal prosecutions, prevented from discussing any of her predecessors in that role, leader of Kensington and Chelsea Council. But Pilgrim Tucker is a housing campaigner who has been on the scene pretty much since that dreadful night. Do you recognise the reality that Councillor Campbell described?
Well, we do know that still many people are living in temporary accommodation. I think there was a couple of interesting things there within what you heard her saying, which was, for example, she's saying people have been offered private sector accommodation. And I think it's very, very important for these people that they are given genuinely secure, affordable, what really can be a permanent home. So I think we know that that many of the offers haven't been suitable.
But that doesn't necessarily have to be controversial, does it? It's only when it gets put through the mangle of tabloid journalism that it sounds like these people have got the audacity to turn their noses up at whatever the first thing. We should be trying, I think, people like you and I, to portray this as a normal process
It should be, and I think in the early days it seemed like that was, the general consensus. But I think as time's gone on, I mean, I've been pretty upset by some of the stuff that I've seen.
I'm sure.
That people have said, comments on newspaper articles or stuff on Twitter, sort of trying to depict these people as very, very undeserving, as if they should just take whatever they're offered, no matter how unsuitable, and be grateful for it. Sort of forgetting that these are our equals. These are, people's friends, brothers, sisters, mothers, people we work with every day, the equivalent, who had nice, secure homes before through absolutely no fault of their own, and that's not in question at all. They've been horribly traumatised, suffered huge loss, and now without permanent homes, and are suffering terribly because of that, and they can't begin to rebuild their lives and progress towards some kind of stability and normality for their children until they do have safe places that they can call home.
The lines she said about the need to win back trust by our deeds and our words, talking, consulting with people in the area, albeit that, of course, we can't discuss her predecessors, but it is a little rare, perhaps, for a politician on a local or a national stage to acknowledge that trust has been lost. I guess she had very little choice, given the stories that emerged very quickly after the fire.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's just so patently obvious.
Yes. Although that doesn't stop a lot of politicians from swimming in the direction of denial, does it?
But on this scale,
yes,
and locally,
right.
I mean, they all do need to be re-elected in May. There is a lot of trust to be won back. I mean, I'm struggling today because I know that some people felt that we shouldn't be talking about politics today, but I find it very difficult to talk about any aspect of this. I mean, aside from very obvious things like the grief and the loss and the terrible, terrible trauma, so many aspects of this are, of course, political.
Well, don't feel in any way constrained. We just mapped a parallel path between celebrating the personal response, the community response, while recognising that shouldn't really necessarily have had to happen and only came about because of the paucity of the political response.
I think also, what maybe a lot of people don't sort of obviously realise that every single small decision by local government, every spending decision, but every choice about where you put that money and how quickly and how effectively you make decisions, all of those things are political. They may not be big capital P party political, but all of these things are political. And it's very important that we're still responding to what essentially are the citizens in this area, and they do have a right to express their views, and we shouldn't be complaining about that. That's a healthy thing within our society.
And the easiest way to understand that would be to ask whether or not you would want the right to complain about your situation if you felt you were being shabbily treated by the people essentially paid to protect your interests. But these are complicated and divided times, Pilgrim, as you know. The people living in hotels, I think we've got a report from one of them, they can't quite feel abandoned, can they? Because they are living in hotels and yet they could feel neglected.
Yeah, well, I can imagine it is very lonely at times, and very, very difficult if you're, a parent having to share a room with your child who doesn't have anywhere to play. You don't have proper cooking facilities to be able to, just do the normal things in life. And yet they're not able to move on to that place where they can start looking forward and can start really making use of things like mental health services. It steps. There's a basic, very, very basic sort of idea that every psychologist or psychotherapist would tell you about, and it's a very simple idea, which is that it's called Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and unless you provide for the very, very basic sort of physical aspects of life, like shelter, like food, you cannot thrive. You can't thrive within your education. You can't thrive in those other, what we consider to be normal functions in life. And that's where those people are still struggling with the very, very basics they need just to get by day to day.
I'm going to take a little break, and when we come back, I'd like to talk to you a little bit more about some of the broader housing issues thrown up by this, because I to my embarrassment, I was shocked to learn some of the details of what often gets filed under the phrase social cleansing. For example, if you are subject to a compulsory purchase order on a former council home that you've purchased under right to buy, you'll be offered a sum of money that is considerably less than what you would need to buy the cheapest property in the development that's been put in the place where your home used to be. And these are the things that seem to have been, I know this is very much your field of interest, they seem to have been just sort of ticking along to the developers' interests, under the wire, under the radar, without noticing. And I hesitate to use the phrase silver lining, but at least the Grenfell tragedy has an opportunity to bring these sort of practices, these remarkably widespread practices, to a wider audience. So we'll talk to you shortly just a little more about that. The time is 12:19. After 12, you're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, live from the Maxilla Social Centre, which became something of an epicentre for community support in the aftermath of the Grenfell Tower fire. 6 months today, anniversary marked by a memorial service at St Paul's, which has just concluded, so we'll cross over there imminently. But before, just a couple more minutes with the housing campaigner Pilgrim Tucker from the Radical Housing Network. Now, I mentioned the name of the organisation because the gentleman responsible for the Grenfell Tower Action Group blog is associated with, is very much involved with the Radical Housing Network as well. And it is perhaps a phrase that sounds a little bit apocalyptic, which is why it hasn't received the attention I now realise it deserves, that the notion of social cleansing. A lot of the reason why there is suspicion of the authorities in this corner of Kensington is not just because of the work of people like the blog, the Grenfell Tower blog, but because there is a sense that certain interests, whether political or commercial, don't want ordinary people living in some of the most valuable real estate in the Western world.
Yes, and in this area there has been, I think it was called the Latimer Plan, a plan to take a huge swathe of this area, demolish it, rebuild it for private sale. So much, much more expensive, far less, if any, social housing, and prices to rent and certainly prices to buy really out of the reach of anybody in this area.
This is perhaps the best lever for people who are struggling to muster, for whatever reason, for people who struggle to muster empathy. It's just to imagine what it would be like if you owned your home, because of course this will affect tenants as well, but to focus first on homeowners or mortgage holders, and you were proud of it, and you also loved the area where you live. There's a lot to love about North Kensington. I used to live here myself. And then to be told by faceless bureaucrats, authority, call it what you will, that you have to move. And they will pretty much determine how much money you get, and you will subsequently discover that that is considerably shy of the amount of money you would need to buy a new home in the same area, let alone the same development. You will be priced out of your own area, and that's what we mean by social cleansing.
Yes, and hopefully most people in London will have heard more about this, because it has gone on to a huge extent throughout the city, right across London. A lot of estates in Barnet, for instance, in Southwark, in Lambeth, over in East London. It's a common phenomena, and basically that is what happened.
And the Elephant and Castle being a case that's done and dusted already. That was when we first started talking about this on LBC. That it was people from that estate in Elephant that were ringing in to say, "This has already happened to us, James. This has already happened to us," and nobody noticed.
Yes, and it's happening now in Cressingham Gardens estate at this very moment in Lambeth, and exactly that. So people who either themselves bought their home up under right to buy, or bought what was formerly a council home at one point, are being offered an amount of money for their home, which that will never allow them to afford something within London, let alone within the area in which they lived.
And this wouldn't happen if it weren't for the social housing provision on the same estates. It's not like a compulsory purchase to build a railway or HS2 or something like that. It is literally a property development that they are being caught up in. Pilgrim, thanks ever so much for coming down today. Look after yourself. Let's cross live now to St Paul's, where LBC's Lucy Hoff has been covering the memorial service marking 6 months since the Grenfell Tower tragedy.
Yes, the service has now concluded, and residents and survivors are now standing on the steps and in the foyer just beyond the church, and they're talking to each other, again hugging and chatting. Many of them are carrying white roses. We just saw an extraordinarily powerful moment when the residents gathered on the steps carrying the white banner with the Grenfell heart that's been specially commissioned for this service. After a really moving multi-faith service that involved speeches from representatives of local churches in the Grenfell area. We heard from the St Paul's Choir, and also we heard a performance from an oud, which is an instrument traditionally used in Middle Eastern music. So let's have a listen to how that service played out, beginning with an address from the Bishop of Kensington.
The evening of June the 13th was an evening like any other in London. It had been a hot day, and the sun went down on a calm, gentle night. That evening, people went out for a meal, went to bed, stayed up talking, doing what people do in London on a warm summer's evening. And yet that night was to change the lives of so many here in this cathedral and beyond today.
We pray for those who have offered their support, for all who sustain us with their care and friendship.
We pray for those who survived this tragedy, for all who are scarred by the horrors of that fateful night. May all our memories be healed.
We pray for the communities of which we are part, for those alongside whom we live. May our shared sorrows bring us closer together.
We've also heard from Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, this morning about why this service is so important.
Well, we come together today to remember those 71 people who tragically lost their fire at Grenfell Tower. Young, old, children, parents, grandparents, friends, loved ones and neighbours who tragically lost their lives. And today, I think I speak for all Londoners and, dare I say, the entire country, and say they'll be in our thoughts and prayers.
It was an event which has brought up a load of social issues, many of which still need to be addressed, don't they, in the capital?
Sure. Anybody who was in that area on the day, it's changed them forever. Whether you're somebody who's a resident in Grenfell Tower and survived, whether you're a neighbour, whether you visited the tragic fire, lots of serious issues that need to be resolved, need to be addressed, whether it's by the public inquiry, whether it's by the review, whether it's by prosecutions. But today's about remembering those who've lost their lives. It's about thinking about those grieving, bereaved families, the survivors still traumatised, still grieving, some angry, many frustrated, and we come together today in solidarity to let them know we'll never forget. 6 months on, there's a concern that things have moved on, they've been forgotten, they won't be forgotten.
Lucy Hoff reporting there from St Paul. A special programme today marking the 6-month anniversary of the Grenfell Tower tragedy. In a moment we'll cross back to St Paul's to hear from the chair of the Grenfell Recovery Scrutiny Committee. Before that, just very briefly, something rather lovely happened during that last news bulletin that I know many of you will appreciate. Adrian, the firefighter whose call we took in the immediate aftermath of the fire, and which we played out again earlier because it encapsulates so much of what went on that night. He just popped down to the Maxilla Social Centre to say hello, and I haven't met him before in person, obviously, so I'm delighted to tell you that he's in absolutely fine fettle, and although obviously possessed of memories from that night that you wouldn't wish on your worst enemy. That's the job that these men and women signed up for, and it's always slightly humbling for me to be reminded of their daily reality. Let's cross now to the Reverend Robert Thompson, a North Kensington Labour councillor, a Church of England priest and a chair of of the Grenfell Recovery Scrutiny Committee. You must have a very big business card, Robert. That's an awful lot of titles that you have to squeeze into such a small space.
Well, good to speak to you, James. But I've just one business card which just has my council stuff on it. Yeah.
I see. Talk to me about today's service. What was it sort of designed to achieve, and how successful was it in doing so?
I think the main thing that it was designed to do was to make sure that we remembered those who have died, and that's why we're here today, and to keep the fight for justice for Grenfell on the agenda, which is really important. I think especially around this Christmas period, Grenfell might have fallen off the agenda, but having the 6-month anniversary memorial service is really important in keeping it in everyone's minds.
Indeed it is, and of course the negative of that is that it brings back memories. There was some research published yesterday showing that both the 6-month anniversary and Christmas could of course revivify some of the horrors that people experienced that night, even on a incomparable level. I lost my dad 5 years ago this Sunday, and I know that as Christmas comes closer, that memory becomes more acute. Times that by 1 million, and you'll get close to what some of the Grenfell survivors may be experiencing in the coming weeks.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, and especially when you come to holiday periods and festivals such as Christmas, obviously grief does become heightened. But I think if we look at sort of what the Bishop said in his sermon today, which I think was really important, that he was calling us to listen, to love and to work for a better city. And as far as I can see in my work as chair of the Grenfell Scrutiny Committee, it's really important that we work towards making sure everybody is rehoused as soon as possible, making sure that people have packages of care in place for those affected and for the bereaved, making sure that the inquiry gets to the bottom of what it has to get to and bring any authorities or those individuals who are responsible historically for what has happened to account. And I think that was a really important message that was there at the heart of quite a lot of the themes of the service today.
This is quite an odd question to ask a man of the cloth, because in many ways the distinction I'm about to describe defines the role of clerics, of priests. But how much of what you've just described as being necessary and urgent should be undertaken by the official authorities, and how much should be undertaken by, if you will, the unofficial authorities, the charities, the volunteers, which, although properly organised, are operating at least in part on goodwill and generosity, rather than on the social contract that taxpayers expect to enter into with local and national government?
Well, obviously, James, I think what we had was a tragedy of national proportions, so we do need national government to step up and to work towards resolutions to these urgent issues. We also, of course, need the council to do that, but you're quite right that we should be working in partnership with voluntary and community organisations and with faith communities in order to help reflect the diversity of those affected in the North Kensington communities, and also to bring help that is appropriate to those diverse needs.
Could you tell my listeners just a little bit about this corner of London, because we're a national radio station. There'll be plenty of people who haven't made their way up that road and seen to their left the charred shell of the building. They won't know why this constant refrain since the night of the fire has been about the community spirit in North Kensington. As a priest of the parish, you'll have a particular insight into that.
I think the community spirit is part of the reflection of the fact that there are so many diverse communities in North Kensington, and these have always had very, very strong commitment to the local community, to doing things collectively as a community, to working across different communities, different ethnic and faith backgrounds, and celebrating the diversity of North Kensington. That's very much there, and it's very much been a part of my experience of living in that area.
And to put your politician hat back on and to temporarily set aside the collar, I appreciate this is your professional remit as well. How well is Kensington and Chelsea Council performing? You of course sit in opposition to the council leaders, but one would hope that cooperation was rather more in place during this period than it would be ordinarily.
Well, obviously, I'm the chair of the Scrutiny Committee, and we scrutinise what the leader and the lead members do. And a number of things have come up in my Scrutiny Committee that for us in which we want to try and be constructively critical of the leadership in order to up the pace of the response. Certainly the key issues for us are in relation to the speed and appropriateness of the housing acquisition policy of the council and then how people are being rehoused. Then secondly, in relation to the key workers and the care packages that are put in place for those affected, for those who used to live in the tower and for those who have been bereaved. So those are the issues that we really want to be helpfully critical about in order to step up the pace of change.
That leader, Elizabeth Campbell, told us yesterday on LBC that by Christmas the council will have 300 properties. It will have purchased 300 properties, been doing so at a rate of 2 a day. She used a word I hadn't heard before, actually, right, overage, which means there's more. Good.
Yeah, I mean, certainly from our last scrutiny committee, the rate at which the council are now buying properties has dramatically increased, and I think some of that is to do with actually the amount of scrutiny that we as committee bring to bear on the council by putting pressure on them to increase the pace of change.
So realistically, if there are going to be 300 properties in place by Christmas and there are now 210 households in need of one, things could be done and dusted relatively quickly?
Well, obviously, we need to wait for those who need to be rehoused to take up their offers at the pace that they wish to, which is obviously what the council and Elizabeth Campbell has committed herself to. But yes, I mean, those properties should be in place, and the possibility for people to be rehoused fairly quickly shouldn't be too far around the corner.
Great stuff. Reverend Robert Thompson, North Kensington Labour councillor, chair of the Grenfell Recovery Scrutiny Committee and a Church of England priest. Many thanks indeed for your time today, Robert, talking to us live from St Paul's, where of course that service has been taking place. Can I squeeze another play of that thing in before the next break? I just want you to hear once again, as promised, the visit that Rachel Venables made to Kids on the Green, a charity that essentially sprang up the day after the tragedy, led by Zoe Levac, who we have spoken to and been able to offer some support to on this programme. But there's some children's laughter. There is no finer sound, I don't believe, on this planet than the laughter of children. And to hear it in the context of this particular part of London and this particular story is, well, you see for yourself.
This is really the main hall where most of the activities happen, and the far side over here is where we tend to do our activities that are sort of physical, where the kids are running around. The unfinished room, it's going to be our art therapy room. So we've got a plumber coming in about half an hour to sort of continue working on it. So we're really trying to reach out to the adolescents in the community for the art therapy, because there's already quite a lot of art therapy happening with adults further down the road. Over here is kind of like our just our comfy area, really. So a lot of the chairs and the sofas that are in there are normally in here. So really it's just where the mums sit and chat. You can see over there, there's one of our counsellors is talking to one of our mums that's been quite affected by everything here. So we work with a team of trauma and grief counsellors all the time. So every single session we have at least 2 of them here, and we always have mental health first aid trained practitioners as well.
Hug yourself. Hi, I'm Kai, I'm 6. Hi, I'm Evie and I'm 6.
Tell me a bit about Kids on the Green. What's your favourite bit about coming here?
As doing the hula hoop.
And do you know why Kids on the Green was set up? Do you know what it's for?
What?
After the fire, Kids on the Green happened so that you guys had a place to come to where you can
Wait, I know something.
Yeah?
Our friend Talene lives in that tower. Somebody left the fridge on for 1 minute in the middle of the night, and then fire starting happening.
And how do you feel when you see the tower?
Sad.
That's fair enough. But when you come here, you can feel happy and you can enjoy it.
Yeah. Simon says, tickle that girl's back.
Hi, I'm Aaron and I'm 13 years old. What I remember is me waking up until, my mum waking me up at 2 a.m. saying there's a fire. And at first she thought it was like my school. Next we realised it's the tower straight next to it, Grenfell Tower. And like the first thing I think of was like my friends who live there, and I've got about like 5 or 6 that go to my school. I'm not necessarily friends with each and every one of them, but I know all of them like fairly well. And yesterday was one of their birthdays. Miena, happy birthday and rest in peace. And yeah.
Coming here then to Kids on the Green, does that help at all?
Really good, because it's just like a way for kids and adults to express themselves. They can chat, they can kids can meet new people, and they can just have fun and have a laugh.
What's the best bit of it for you then? What's the bit you look forward to the most when you come here?
All of it.
Rachel Venables reporting there from the Kids on the Green, which when we first met them was a couple of volunteers, a couple of footballs and a blanket. They subsequently, thanks to the generosity of listeners to this programme, secured and many others, but specifically the lock-up that they needed. The shipping container was provided by listeners from this programme, a listener to this programme, and now we've been inundated with offers from roofers who may, hopefully, everything crossed, be able to stem the leak in the roof of the warehouse that they now call home, because they've got their Christmas party on Saturday and nobody wants to see Santa get a soaking. The time now is 12:47. Live today from the Maxilla Social Centre, which sits a couple of hundred yards from the base of Grenfell Tower. The scene 6 months ago today of that unspeakable tragedy. And yet today, to my surprise, perhaps, I'm going to come away with a slightly more uplifted sense than I either expected to or did last time. And that is because largely, if not quite entirely, due to the efforts of residents, communities, sympathisers, volunteers, decent people, there's a sense of resurrection in this corner of London. Rachel Venables has been keeping rather closer tabs on developments in the last 6 months among families still affected. Not just, of course, those who lived in the tower itself, but I mean, I don't need to tell anybody what tower blocks are like. Usually in the immediate area, you'll have properties that are part of the same estate. On this estate, they're called the walkways, aren't they, Rachel? And You've been keeping in touch with families both from within the tower itself and from the walkways in the immediate area.
And I think something that many people might not realise is it's not just the people who physically lived in that tower, who were affected. We know about the wider community, the mental health impact, the fact that many people are grieving. It's not just the people who physically lived in Grenfell who were affected, but also, as you mentioned, the walkways. There are people whose houses immediately surrounded the tower, just in the immediate sort of the below of it, and they also lost their homes that night. They saw cladding drop down, they saw their homes covered in smoke, covered in water, and absolutely destroyed. And one family, one of the many families who were displaced by this fire, the Al Saadi family, they're wonderful, 4 young children, and I went to meet with them just a couple of weeks ago, because for them 6 months on from the fire means 6 months still in a hotel approaching Christmas with no sign of a new permanent home in sight. The family meet me in the reception of a budget hotel in West London. As we approach the lift, pushing the buggy, carrying school bags and shopping, the older boy, 5-year-old Kais, points to a warning sign. You shouldn't travel in the lift if there's a fire, he tells me solemnly, while his sister, 7-year-old Yusra, says, and there are parts of this building which don't even have a fire escape. Clearly something they've been worrying about since the night of the 14th of June.
Double, double this, double, double that, double this, double that, double this. I always get it wrong.
There isn't a lot of space for playing in the hotel room.
My bedroom was pink and I had like loads of stickers everywhere. I had a bunk bed and it was frozen. I had loads of teddies and I really miss my toys.
But Alyssa's dad Ahmad tells me they've been in a hotel since the night of the fire.
2-room with active children, in total of 55 or 60 foot, and it's really tight, small. It is a small. Sleep, wake up, sleep, and that's it, really. You don't have much really to go through or to go about.
The 4 children now share 2 double beds. They do their homework on a tiny desk and eat with their parents on a mat that's laid out on the floor. All the while, they're having to deal with the horrors of Grenfell, coming to terms with losing their homes, their friends, and the memory of what they saw on the night of the fire.
I just try to not remember anything. It's just very scary if you look at it. Yeah. It feels very creepy. I don't like it because they talk about too much and it makes you sad, and you have to sing these songs, and that makes me cry. I don't like it. Because in school, like, every day, my teacher's like, how are you? How was telling me stuff about, like, I don't want to talk about it anymore. It's too much.
One way to forget about it came with a holiday to the coast last month, offered by a new project, Cornwall Hugs Grenfell. Ahmad said it gave them a chance to be a normal family again.
Like, we do the cooking together, watching TV together. We have enough space to move around. That house is really, we had really the best time, and we felt we're back again as a family.
Well, for one of his children, it really started to help him heal.
His friend, Zainab, she passed away. My wife, she did mention this during the trip, like maybe the last 4 or 5 days. She's saying Kais is becoming more calm down. He's not like more active how he used to be, because after the fire we felt Kais is changing his and he did really become better than how he used to.
That week certainly helped them to recover, but back here in London, 6 months on from the fire, these 2 hotel rooms with an adjoining door are still the family's only home.
Rachel Venables reporting for LBC. Rachel is with me at the Maxilla Social Centre in North Kensington, or Notting Dale, I think, to be precise. How are we going to do this, Rachel, moving forward? 6 months now to the day. You've been keeping in close touch with families like that one and many of the other people involved. We have made a promise. I did it on your behalf. I probably should have asked your permission, to people in this community, that we will never allow focus to move away. So how are we going to continue to cover this?
I think, well, for many of the community, what I've noticed, certainly more now that we're back here 6 months on compared to where we were a month ago, is that families like this, survivors, people who lost loved ones, are really starting to find their voice in a much more organised way. They're starting to organise, they're starting to say, what messaging do we want to get out there? Not in a contrived way, but in a just being honest and making sure that the public are aware of what they're going through. And in many ways, if you think about the silent march, which happens, it takes place just a couple of streets away from where we are now, and it ends up in the wonderful decorated space outside the Maxilla Club. That's a silent march, and what they stress every single month is they want it to be silent and respectful. They want to reflect. They don't want anger and rage, and it's just about listening to them, I think, moving forward, allowing them to make those messages, allowing their messages not to be hijacked. That's all we can really do.
Rachel Venables, thank you very much indeed. Our colleague Lucy Hoff is still at St Paul's, where I gather you've managed to do this thing that all my colleagues are seeming to be able to do, but I still can't. You've had a chat with Jeremy Corbyn.
Yes, the Labour leader made his way out of the church and spent almost an hour on the patio just beyond, talking to residents and survivors and those bereaved families. They were expressing their concern that so many of them were still homeless, and many of them supportive of him and saying that they felt he was on their side. I asked him whether he felt this was a fitting tribute.
It was appropriate, and the attendance by so many of the families was great, and the way the children laid green hearts down was beautifully done, and the music I particularly liked. There's a place for us.
And what lessons still need to be learnt 6 months on? We've still got so many of the families living in temporary accommodation, so many who need to be rehoused. What needs to happen now?
Of course we have to mourn. Of course we have to mourn those that have died as a result of the fire, but the families that were suffered in that fire should not be in hotels, should not be in bed and breakfast. For goodness sake, we're the 6th richest country in the world. Can't we house 400 families?
Jeremy Corbyn there speaking to LBC's Lucy Hoff. The silent walk that Rachel Venables referred to unfolds every the 14th of every month, and will, of course, tonight be a particularly poignant occasion. The gathering begins at the Notting Hill Methodist Church on Lancaster Road here in Notting Hill, and at 7 o'clock the silent walk begins. Afterwards there is a chance, particularly tonight, to stay around and listen to speakers speaking to and for this remarkable and, I think, returning community. That's it from me for another day. I'm James O'Brien. You've been listening to LBC. The next voice you will hear belongs to Sheila Fogarty.